Hi, I'm James Wallner, host of the podcast Dakota Spotlight. In 1999, a young man with a bright future was tragically murdered at his workplace in Bismarck, North Dakota. In Homicide at House of Bottles, a new 6-part series, I take you behind the scenes of the investigation with exclusive interviews, original archival audio, and a deep dive into this peculiar crime. Listen to Dakota Spotlight in our newest season anywhere you get your podcasts or at dakotaspotlight.com.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Citizen Detective. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Megan, and welcome back, listeners. Today we're delving into part 2 of the officially unsolved case of Betsy Aardsma. If you haven't listened to part 1, we highly recommend that you go back and listen before starting this episode. For those of you who have already listened to part 1, we last left off with the Pennsylvania State Troopers being called out to investigate the mysterious death of Betsy Aardsma after she collapsed in the stacks of Penn State's Pattee Library in November of 1969. Much to the troopers' distress, they found a contaminated crime scene, and over an hour had passed between Betsy being found and the university finally calling in the state troopers to investigate. As we know from so many other cases, the first 48 hours are really critical to a murder investigation, as well as an untouched crime scene, so the troopers knew that they were already starting at a disadvantage. Now, as I mentioned last time, investigative journalist David D. Koch believes that he has solved the case and will be giving his point of view throughout today's episode, along with his research to back his claim. However, this is technically an unsolved case, and it's very possible that David is wrong. So we're very interested to hear what our listeners think. Please make sure to drop us a review or a social media post with who you think killed Betsy Aardsma. So let's dive back in. Aside from the contaminated crime scene, the Pennsylvania State Troopers were also facing a few other barriers. For one, the state police was a fairly new organization, having only been created in 1905. And because Pennsylvania was so rural in the 60s and had a fairly small population, most of the troopers had very little experience in any investigative work, let alone a homicide. There was only one officer, Sergeant George Keebler, who specialized in criminal investigations at the trooper barracks about 15 miles away from Penn State. And unfortunately, he was on vacation the night that Betsy was found. While the on-call specialist, Corporal Dan Brode, was sent in his place, Brode didn't have as much experience, and upon taking in the scene, he made an immediate decision that Betsy had been killed by the Nittany Mall rapist.
Oh, okay.
The mall was located about 15 minutes from Penn State, and between 1967 and 1968, an unknown man had abducted 2 women at knife point in the parking lot before driving them out into the woods, raping them, and leaving them for dead. While both women survived, the troopers had no evidence or suspect, and no one was ever arrested in the case. So, unfortunately for Corporal Bode, this was not a plausible scenario. I mean, for one, it would have required the potential rapist to drive to Penn State, park somewhere, go into the library, which was not near the main campus entrances, go down into the dark stacks, find Betsy, try to randomly abduct her, and then kill her when she resisted without anyone hearing it.
I'm sorry, whose theory was this about the Nittany rapist?
One of the new officers on the case.
Okay. When you said it, I was like, oh, that's weird. But I didn't realize it was kind of someone new to the case as well, or newer officers. Yeah. Okay.
And although this isn't plausible, just to make it even more implausible, Betsy had no defensive wounds and she had not been sexually assaulted.
Oh,
so
okay.
It doesn't even fit the MO.
No, that doesn't connect at all.
But unfortunately, while it had little plausibility, Corporal Bode was allowed to pursue his idea, and DeCock wonders if following this implausible lead took valuable resources away from other potential avenues.
Oh.
About 6 hours into the investigation, The troopers were able to interview that student by the name of Marilee. Again, that was the classmate who had found Betsy. They were also able to get an interview with Betsy's roommate. Through them, they found out about David Wright, Betsy's distant boyfriend, and 2 police were immediately dispatched to Hershey to question him. This isn't surprising. As we know, a spouse or significant other is always the first suspect in these types of cases.
Yes. As a reminder, you covered this last episode, but she was basically killed with one pierce to her chest. And I understand that the blood flooded her lungs and she died of exsanguination, but that was really the finding.
That's correct.
Okay.
David was awoken from a sleep around 2 a.m. and grilled by police for about a half hour about where he had been and what he had done all day on Friday, November 28th. Police also questioned David's roommates, and through the 3 men's testimonies, it was clear that David had not been anywhere near Penn State when Betsy was murdered. There was also zero evidence from any of the preliminary interviews that David and Betsy had a bad relationship or that they had fought at all around the time of her death. David was quickly released as a suspect, and the troopers were back at square one. As David was being interviewed, over 40 troopers were called in from Harrisburg to assist in the investigation, and Betsy's dorm room was secured as a crime scene. But unfortunately, nothing in her room gave any clues as to who would have wanted to murder her.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
In a desperate search for any evidence they could muster, troopers carefully combed the surrounding stacks where Betsy had gone down. They managed to find a soda bottle with a fingerprint, Betsy's winter coat, and the books that she had been studying before she had been killed. They were all boxed up with about 100 books from the unit that had fallen where she was found. And basically, this was just to check for prints.
Right.
And about 3 rows away from the murder scene, police found 2 hardcover books of pornography that laid open on a study desk. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, pornography was illegal in the 60s, so the fact that these books had been left out and left open was very strange. And likewise, these books were unique in that they would have been very expensive for the times, around $90 in today's money.
Oh.
They also didn't have any call numbers or library stamps, so they were privately owned and someone brought them into the library with them.
Interesting.
Trooper Simmers, who found them, deduced that whoever owned them had left them in a hurry, which was odd considering that they were both highly expensive and also illegal. Now, is it possible that these belonged to the murderer? I mean, no one really knew, but they were bagged for further investigation. In the same area, Simmers uncovered about 30 more cheap paperback pornography books that had been secretly tucked in between the academic library books. Unsure if they were related or not, these were also collected.
This is really bizarre to me. All the pornography, the pornography, especially in this one library. I don't know. I must be missing something, but okay, go ahead.
The police also called in one of Penn State's chemistry professors, a woman by the name of Mary Willard, to see if she could obtain any forensic evidence that may have been left after the cleanup. While this may seem strange to us, Professor Willard had been doing forensic analysis for the state troopers since 1945, as it was difficult to get the actual crime forensics unit from the Harrisburg barracks to come out as far as State College.
Okay.
She used a blacklight along the library stacks to look for blood, but she did not find any. Instead, the blacklight uncovered large amounts of human semen covering the floors and even the books on the shelves. As one trooper recalled, quote, "It looked like they had had orgies on the floor."
Oh my gosh. This is crazy to me what's going on at this library, right?
Library, yeah. Professor Willard did find one blood spot on the wall of the stairwell leading back to the card catalog. So she took samples of it and some of the semen from the stacks, hoping that something would come back to Betsy's murderer.
Okay.
Unfortunately, while the blood from the stairwell did come back to Betsy, none of the semen seemed connected to the crime, as there was none found on Betsy's person or on her clothing. In addition, that soda bottle that was collected, that belonged to one of the public safety officers who had been first on the scene. So by the first week of the investigation, the troopers really had nothing to go on, and tracking down witnesses who would give them information proved very difficult.
Okay.
Though troopers were able to interview Marilee, as well as the exchange student, the only description of the man who'd run out of the stacks where Betsy had been killed was that he was a tall, thin white male with light brown hair and had been wearing khaki work pants and a light-colored jacket.
Oh, the khaki pants. Yes, gotcha.
As this fit the description of most of the young men on campus, the composite sketch sent out to the public in hopes of getting leads basically yielded nothing. And because of how much anti-Vietnam and civil rights protesting had been broken up by the state police in recent months, most of the student body and much of the faculty did not like the police, and they were not interested in being cooperative. But despite the lack of cooperation, police were still able to interview over 12,000 people over the first 4 months of Betsy's investigation. And in the mix, they managed to come up with one suspect, and that would be Betsy's fellow English classmate, Larry Paul Maurer.
And this would be one of the 2 young men that Betsy went out with. Is that's correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And Larry was tall and thin with sandy blonde hair, which slightly fit the description given by the witnesses. And recall, he had essentially been rejected by Betsy after he asked her out to go to the movies.
Did not recall that. Oh, that was the one that fizzled quickly. Okay, yes. All right.
And if you recall, he was also an outdoorsman who had been known to carry a small hunting knife on his person.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay.
When police questioned him in his dorm, which again is the same dorm as Betsy's, they noticed that he had freshly carved the phrase, quote, "Here sits death in the guise of a man," on the arm of a wooden chair.
Okay.
It was surmised that because they were in the same class, she would have known him and that they would likely be writing papers in the same area of the library. So him coming across her in the stacks wouldn't have surprised her, which could have led him to being able to kill her without making any noise. I mean, he seemed like an excellent suspect, but of course he adamantly denied killing Betsy after several hours of intense interrogation, and he also passed the polygraph.
Oh, okay.
With no actual evidence to hold him, Larry was released, though many officers, including Chief Investigator Keebler, always felt that Larry knew something more about Betsy's murder than he was saying. Over the course of the long investigation, he would be interrogated several more times, but nothing ever came of it. After 3 months, most of the troopers who had been called from Harrisburg were sent home, and Sergeant Kleber worked with 4 detectives to continue the investigation. And though they worked the case for over a year, police were no closer to figuring out who had killed Betsy by the anniversary of her death.
Sorry, what about the second man that she went out with? Is he going to come back into play?
We shall see. By Christmas of 1970, Betsy's case had gone into what Keebler referred to as sleep mode. No matter how much Sergeant Kleber and his detectives dug into Betsy's life, looking for any clue that would turn up someone who would want her dead, Betsy had led a quiet, uncomplicated life. There were no red flags, clues, or discernible options for who she could have run into that would have wanted to hurt her. Even after putting up a $25,000 reward, which would be around $160,000 in today's money, no one stepped forward to claim it with any information. All Kleber and his detectives could do was wait for tips to come in, and none ever did.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
Immediately upon finding out that she had been killed, Betsy's parents flew out to Penn State the morning after her death to take her body back to Holland, Michigan. Her family was in obvious shock, and though also interviewed by state troopers for information on Betsy's life, her parents could give nothing helpful to the cops that might lead them to finding her killer. Her funeral was held in the family's church in Holland, where every pew was packed with her large extended family, many friends, and the tight-knit Holland community. But while her murder was on every front-page newspaper in Holland and the surrounding areas, as well as the towns that surrounded Penn State, unfortunately for Betsy and her family, her story would soon be overshadowed by the uptick in violent Vietnam War protests at Penn State in 1970. There were also some high-profile murder cases, such as the Manson murders out of California and the United Mine Workers of America murders in Pennsylvania. From an investigative standpoint, the press was unhelpful in keeping Betsy's case in the public eye. But from her family's perspective, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Sergeant Kleber would later say that Betsy's family didn't seem to need to know who killed their daughter for any sense of justice. Over the 2 years of active investigation, he claimed that they never seemed particularly happy when he called them with updates, and at no point did they call him to pressure him about finding out who killed their daughter. Decock speculates that much of this may be part of the stoicism that was prevalent in the Holland community at the time. While of course her family was grieving at their tremendous loss, and it destroyed many of them. Actually, just to give you more information on how the family was affected, after the murder, her parents got divorced, her father descended into alcoholism, and her older sister and brother-in-law also got divorced. So since the family was having so much trouble dealing with this, it could be possible that the wound of losing Betsy was reopened anytime the police called.
Absolutely.
And Decock suggests that letting Betsy's case fade into the past may have been more beneficial to the family than a relentless search for justice.
That's understandable. I just want to point out that we should never fault families for the way they choose to grieve. And
In fact, on behalf of the whole family, Betsy's sister and brother-in-law actually wrote a letter to the U.S. Supreme Chief Justice in 1972 to nationally strike down the death penalty so that if Betsy's killer was ever discovered, he would not face death. In their letter, they wrote, quote, "Betsy loved America. Her only real concern in life dealt with the preservation and improvement of human life. Therefore, the execution of her murderer would be a glaring contradiction to everything she lived for."
That's an interesting preemptive move. That's something that we've seen in cases after a perpetrator has been apprehended, but I haven't heard of anyone taking those proactive steps before. It's interesting. Okay.
I respect it, but I haven't heard cases like this either. Deacock argues that a lack of pressure from the family, coupled with their distance from Pennsylvania, may have been part of the reason why Betsy's case was never officially solved. But there was also another much bigger reason that the case was not solvable. Key information never made it to the police. And that information is how David Deacock believes that he found the killer.
So who is it? I'm anxiously awaiting who this person is and how he found or determined who the perpetrator was or who he believes it was.
Okay, well, he didn't actually come up with his own suspect. He just publicized what was already there. In 1986, an author named Pamela West was hoping to write a novel about Betsy's unsolved case and began interviewing several professors from Penn State who had been working at the time of Betsy's death. One, a geology professor named Lauren Wright, told West that one of his students, Rick Hafner, had showed up at his door unannounced the night of the murder. Wright's story was confirmed by Penn State's Dean Holzer, as in 1976, 7 years after Betsy's death, Dr. Wright finally told the dean that he thought Rick Hafner may have been Betsy's murderer. You see, on the night of Betsy's death, Rick had showed up at Dr. Wright's house around 6 p.m., which is only about an hour after the murder, wanting to know if the murder had hit the papers. Now, what's interesting about this is at this point, not even the state troopers had been called yet, so there was no way anyone could have known about Betsy being murdered. Everyone still thought she had a seizure, and no press would even go out about the incident until the next morning. So Deacock surmises that only the murderer would have known about the murder, especially since Dr. Wright specifically remembered Rick asking if, quote, anyone heard about the murder of that girl.
Okay. I mean, that's what he thinks he remembers, so that's fair.
And you recall Rick was the other gentleman that Betsy dated for that short time.
Yes.
Rick stayed at Dr. Wright's house for about an hour, and when he found it clear that no one knew about the murder, he left suddenly. And though Rick had been to Dr. Wright's home several times before to talk about his geology work, Dr. Wright described him as overly odd on that particular night. But at the time, Dr. Wright wasn't sure what to make of the strange behavior. And as Rick returned to campus after Thanksgiving like nothing was wrong, no alarm bells went off for the professor at the time. Likewise, Rick was called for a routine interview with police about a week after the murder. But because Dr. Wright hadn't reported his strange behavior, police were only interviewing him because he had gone on some dates with Betsy, and they were hoping that they could get some information about her character. In the police interviews, Rick was described as cordial, and he claimed that he had heard of her death the day after it happened. He also had no criminal record, and he didn't act suspicious, so they let him go as just another one of the 12,000 witnesses in the case. But unbeknownst to the investigators, there were many suspicious things about Rick that nobody knew about.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
And I'd like to drop a trigger warning here as we move forward. We will be talking about child molestation, so extra listener discretion is advised. So what is revealed about Rick's past? For starters, after being severely bullied in middle school, Rick always carried a handmade knife, and this was also true of his time at Penn State, as Dr. Wright had noticed it on his person on several occasions. And this knife was quite thin, with a blade more like a stiletto than a usual pocket knife. Wright didn't know about Rick's past and assumed that he used it for purposes of extracting rocks at geology sites. Next, Rick wore khaki pants every day, no matter what else his outfit required. And the khaki pants over the oddly formal sport coat were the most definitive descriptions given by witnesses of the man running away from Betsy's murder scene. But I think most importantly, Rick did have quite the criminal past. It just was not documented.
Oh, well, like what?
In 1962, at the age of 19, when he was working as a camp counselor for his local YMCA, he was reported to Lancaster police for soliciting sex from an elementary-age boy. But as far as documents show, he was never charged or arrested.
Oh.
Then in 1965, when Rick was an assistant scoutmaster for a Boy Scout troop, one of the boys admitted to his parents that Rick had reached into his sleeping bag and fondled his genitals during a campout. And it turned out that several other boys in the troop had experienced the same molestations from Rick, and this was between 1962 and 1965. And while Rick was immediately dismissed from the troop and banned from the National Boy Scouts of America after the allegations came to light, no criminal charges were ever filed with the police.
Wow.
And because of that, he was able to get a job as a camp counselor at a day camp near his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And it was here that he met two young boys, ages 10 and 11. Now, these boys had a single mom. And Rick persuaded the mom to let him take her boys on a beach vacation to Ocean City, Maryland, since it was something that she was not able to afford to do for them. But while there, he molested both boys, who told their mother upon their return. And while she did have Rick fired from the camp job, she never went to the police to report the crime, nor did the camp call in law enforcement to launch an investigation. I don't know if you know much about this, but from what I believe, in the 1960s, pedophilia was not really seen so much as a criminal act. It was almost more of a moral depravity that was dealt with in civil courts and would sometimes result in counseling, religious confessions, and other non-criminal outcomes.
Yeah.
Pedophilia would not be seen as a crime until the mid-1970s, I believe.
Yes, that's true. What's also true, if you look at it too, is the way there was a stigma that was brought not upon perpetrators, but victims. So reporting it, people were embarrassed. They didn't want their child to be labeled. So that would explain also lower levels of reporting at that time.
Yes. As Rick entered his graduate studies at Penn State, the, quote, creepiness that Betsy described in her letters to her family began to further materialize. In 1967, while doing field work with Dr. Wright out in Death Valley, Rick met a young woman named Susan Sorrell, and by all accounts, he became obsessed with her. When she didn't return his advances, he drove over 400 miles between Penn State and Susan's school, Smith College, and knocked on the door of her dorm unannounced to proclaim his love for her. She found this gross and creepy and asked him to leave, which he did without incident. However, when working in Death Valley the following year with Susan, Rick was reported as being on his best behavior, but definitely acting as if there was something else going on under the surface. By the 1970s, while Rick was finishing his doctorate, Dr. Wright noticed that Rick often brought young boys from his hometown of Lancaster to visit the Rock and Mineral Museum at Penn State. At the time, Dr. Wright just thought Rick was doing a nice civic duty for the boys of his community and trying to get them interested in geology. However, the dean seemed better able to sniff Rick out for what he was, so when Rick applied to be director of Penn State's Mineral Museum, the dean had turned him down. Unfortunately, though, the dean did not alert authorities to his suspicions about Rick's constant boy companions. Mostly, I think, probably because he just had suspicions and no proof.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it allowed the next phase of Rick's life to happen. I'm not saying it's the dean's fault that anything else happened.
No.
And also, this all happened before Dr. Wright came forward to say that he thought Rick had perhaps murdered Betsy. Rick's disappointment in not getting the director position at Penn State's Mineral Museum led him to open up his own rock shop next to his childhood home in Lancaster. He went hunting for minerals and then hired many of the middle school boys from the area to break the rocks apart and put them in special boxes that was sold to museum gift shops. One of these boys was Rick's own cousin, a 12-year-old named Chris Hafner. When interviewed, Chris recalled absolutely idolizing Rick, both for the fact that he had a doctorate and he was impeccably good at finding rare minerals, but also because he paid the boys well for their work and took them on trips to show them how to find the minerals themselves. But Rick was still a pedophile, and he molested Chris, as well as several of the other boys that he employed. And two of these boys finally did go to the police, which led to an investigation against him. And in 1975, Rick Hafner was officially charged and arrested for pedophilia. Chris, who was still working at the rock shop, which again was right next door to the Hafner's home, says he overheard Rick's mother shouting at him about the arrest. During this loud argument, Chris says he clearly overheard Rick's mother say that Rick had gotten away with, quote, killing that girl at Penn State, but was going down for pedophilia. She finished the fight by shouting, quote, "You might as well kill me the way you killed her."
I'm sorry, who reported this? His cousin?
So Chris was the cousin that he molested.
Yeah, okay.
Who worked at the museum. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And just for a little background, Rick's mother doted on Rick and always felt that he could do no wrong. She would often cover for him during the pedophile charges. She worked hard to crush rumors about his behavior anytime they began to spread. And of course, she never alerted authorities after he told her that he had killed Betsy. But she was also very overbearing. It just gives us a little information on their relationship and perhaps his feelings towards women.
Okay.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
Offer valid on standard browsers, U.S. only.
When I heard about Date My Age, I thought, really? But there I was in my empty, quiet house, my laptop on the kitchen counter, and I typed in my name. Looking for a man between the ages of 40 to 60? Sure, why not?
Date My Age is different. With verified profiles, you can feel safe and secure to explore meaningful connections with interesting and mature singles.
Date My Age made it really easy. I could join and view online profiles for free. All of a sudden, my empty house wasn't so quiet anymore. I got so much attention, it just made me feel seen and alive. Date My Age helped me start a totally new chapter in my life.
Find a friend, a lover, a partner at Date My Age. Get 60% off when you join at datemyage.com today. That's datemyage.com to connect with thousands of singles worldwide. datemyage.com.
As Betsy was the only woman killed at Penn State in Rick's time there was no one else that his mother could have been referring to but Betsy Aardsma. When Rick realized that Chris had been able to hear the fight between him and his mother, he took Chris on a special rock-finding excursion and denied ever killing anyone. However, he strangely followed up his declaration of innocence by telling Chris that the Penn State girl was, quote, not who people thought she was. She wasn't a big deal. She was never going to be anybody.
Oh.
At 12 years old, again, Chris is young. Chris is only 12. So at 12 years old, he didn't really know what to do with any of this information. So while he never forgot about it, he also never told anyone what he knew. That is until 2010, when Pennsylvania state troopers were reopening several cold cases to see if they could solve any. And one of those was Betsy's. As in 2010, Dr. Lauren Wright finally, officially reported his belief that Rick Hafner was Betsy's killer. Police put a reward online for anyone with information on Rick Hafner. They had no idea where he was at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Coincidentally, although maybe Rick didn't see this, it was seen by the now 49-year-old Chris Hafner. Remember, Chris was 12 when the abuse and when that fight happened. Chris contacted the troopers' cold case task force with his tip about Rick and his mother's argument in which he says it was clear that he killed Betsy. But unfortunately for the investigation, Rick had passed away in 2002 and his mother had passed away almost a decade before.
Wow.
There was no way to get a confession from the dead, nor was there any hard evidence that linked Rick to the crime. It could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Rick had killed Betsy, and so the case remains on the books as unsolved.
Wow, okay.
However, David DeCock feels that there can be no other suspect, as later on in Rick's life, he showed an immense amount of rage and violence towards women. Rick was in and out of civil court hundreds of times following his arrest and short prison sentence for pedophilia. He sued many of the people who condemned him, including jury members, and there were several documented incidences of him using rage and physical intimidation against female lawyers and other female court staff. Again, sometimes this would happen to the point where he would chase them to their cars and they required security just to get in and out of the buildings.
Whoa, this is intense.
And in 1998, he brutally assaulted a woman in a parking lot of a liquor store when he thought that she was trying to steal his dog, which she wasn't apparently. He had dragged her from her vehicle, choked her, and beat her about the face so hard that she suffered multiple facial reconstructive surgeries and over a year of recovery.
Oh my God.
Though interestingly, there were never any instances where Rick showed this level of aggression or violence towards men. So DeCock uses these instances to prove that Rick may have always just had rage under the surface, and whether this was because he was hoping a young woman like Betsy would prove to be a cover for his pedophilia, or he just had anger issues against women for other reasons.
Right.
It's not out of the question to surmise that he was enraged at Betsy for breaking off their casual relationship.
You also never know what can trigger someone like this who has that rage simmering beneath the surface. I wonder also, you said his mother covered for him a lot. In my head, I wondered what their relationship was like, but you know, it could be even if he was the perpetrator, let's say that Betsy just said something, You know what I mean? Like something small that might be insignificant to one of us, but that triggers that rage that was really there. And it could be the smallest rejection or critique that we might not think could have, led to this, but that could be the fact.
I mean, perhaps word got back to him that she found him creepy.
Yes.
Or maybe she caught him looking at that expensive pornography book and he got embarrassed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe she learned about his pedophilia and he was afraid she would tell someone. There are any number of possibilities for his motive.
Right.
But unfortunately for Betsy, if Rick Hafner was indeed her killer, he died before justice could be done.
Amy, do we know, did he ever get married or have his own children?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I was surprised to find out that there are no lasting legacies for Betsy at State College.
Oh.
Immediately following her death, though, the English graduate department did put together a fund that would allow any graduate English student to borrow money without interest, and it was funded by book auctions. However, this fund only lasted a short while. As far as I could find, there are no plaques, scholarships, or other memorials to her on Penn State or in her hometown of Holland.
Oh.
And while stories of Betsy's murder still circulate among the student body at Penn State today, she tends to be nameless and the stories are nothing close to the truth of what happened. She is simply the girl who was murdered in the library. We hope that by bringing her story to you today that we can give Betsy back her name. And while her case officially remains unsolved, there is always the potential that resharing her story may still help bring her case closure. And if any of our listeners want to dive deeper into Betsy's story, we highly recommend checking out David D. Cox's book, Murder in the Stacks, which we have linked in our show notes. Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/campuskillings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.